What if Clea never really existed? Let's go back to December 33. In this alternative universe, she wasn't pushed to enter the canvas by Clea's demands, but rather pushed by her own grief and pain. On top of suffering physically, she has been completely left alone to deal with the loss of her brother and the loss of her ability to speak without suffering every single waking second. Her only hope was to jump into the canvas, thinking she would find some comfort. Now, she was once born again as Maelle. Her life kept on going, similar to what we already know. Fast forwarding to Expedition 33, Painted Renoir made sure they had a very warm welcome. They got separated, but Gustave never really encountered any Nevrons. Instead, he encountered the soulless version of his previous mentors. You see, since Nevrons never really existed in this alternative universe, the real Renoir had to be a little bit more meticulous. He knew that his dear wife was more powerful than he was. So he conducted this plan of giving the Curator a bit more power than desired, in return of sacrificing his own lifespan. The Curator didn't really have the ability to paint, but granted his new powers from Renoir, he could trap expeditioners and, well, obviously, the previous population of Lumiere, extract their chroma, and then reuse it in order to manipulate the poor souls, rather than just painting new creatures like Nevrons. Over time, the puppets that the Curator acquired have been helping with both weakening Aline and traumatizing future expeditioners. Returning to Gustave, he was eventually found by Lune. On their new quest to find Maelle, they encountered Lune's parents. They were part of Expedition 46, and undoubtedly, they met the same fate as their predecessors. It wasn't enough that their loved ones just vanished left and right, but now they had to fight with those very same people. Despite her logical nature, Lune is deeply affected by this, and thus, you would fight alone as Gustave for half of the fight. After these disturbing occurrences, they finally reunite with Maelle and Ciel, taking SK along the way, and we find ourselves at the Stone Wave Cliffs. Now, Gustave does indeed die, but the Curator would sneakily extract his chroma in order to later use Gustave as a puppet. He was too valuable to just let Gustave's chroma return to Aline. Now we have Verso. He is now introduced, but the formalities would be interrupted by the rising, soulless body of Gustave, disappearing in the shadows in one blink of an eye. In this little fantasy world, Verso has the same desires as we currently know. But Maelle, she's mentally shattered by Gustave's current state and doesn't really know who to blame. Her anger is primarily aimed at Painted Renoir. But by his shocked expression, she doesn't really think he's the one that turned him into a puppet. But one thing was clear: Renoir did try to kill him. Her first objective would be to kill the white-haired man, and she very much succeeded. But what would happen next? Well, you see, Maelle felt like her mind was shattering. Rather than just getting these nightmares with the supposedly white-haired man and painted Alicia, she was now reliving Gustave's soulless resurrection. What kind of power would allow someone to be the puppet master of another soul? Well, she would soon find out, because her trigger was using the Curator's help to erase Painted Renoir. When that initial contact happened, it all came back to her. Her memories of her life were painted with pain and what could only be counted as a future full of suffering. She let it brew inside of her for a few moments. All of Verso's deceits and lies, her mom's resentment towards her, and the feeling of being abandoned by her father laid out in front of her. Anger took over first, and then it all stood still. She became calm, but not for the reasons you might think. This was her only escape, but it felt like everyone was against her very existence. Maelle couldn't really cast her mother out without first being ejected from the canvas herself, while her dad would have complete control over this world. Her plan came down to taking them out simultaneously. Well, kinda. Instead of returning to the island after defeating the Paintress, she asked to take a moment alone by the crumbling monolith, enjoying their victory, or so she had led them to believe. Before departing with the Curator, after defeating Painted Renoir, she decided to take a page out of his book. She was also a paintress after all. While her mother would be on her deathbed before being cast out of the canvas, she would use her powers to take over the chroma that she previously had control over. Using that, after her team departed, she decided to head down underneath the monolith. She was once again reunited with her dad. But it would take a hot minute for him to fully regain control over his unchained body. Using her very last drop of strength, she decided to absorb whatever chroma he had. However strong the Curator was, it was still an avatar created by the real Renoir, and he couldn't exist without the original body. Maelle had to take advantage of this. A very short argument occurred between them before Renoir vanishes from the canvas. The only plea her father had was to return home. Home? For what purpose exactly? As the only child remaining in this family, the blame of her brother's death was going to be further put on her. Maelle took over the canvas as the new Paintress. Knowing Verso's ulterior motives, she tried to make a deal with him, and she wouldn't allow anyone else to take control over the canvas. She could restore his mortality, though. She couldn't set Verso's original soul free, but she could and wanted to grant him a graceful and, well, perhaps a more distant death. Now, her mother was still a risk. She knew that every day she was locked here, her fantasy of Verso would further soothe her grief. But now that she was back in the real world, having her bubble burst, Maelle believed she will try to take control over the canvas once again. She was the reason her mom was in so much pain. And pain can be turned into hatred or resentment. Maelle didn't have a second to actually process her real memories. At a glance, her life as Maelle was filled with love and warmth, while her life as Alicia was filled with pain, resentment, and even hatred. Even her father, claiming to be loving and caring of her, turned out to abandon Alicia. Maelle decided to leave the canvas for a brief moment to take a look at her mom one last time. In her heart, she never wanted to be despised by her own mother. Maybe there was a linger of hope, or so she would make herself believe. Aline's reaction, which was hurtful, but not at all surprising to Maelle, it was a reaction of disgust. Grief turned into hatred, because it's easier to hate and blame someone else than to accept that you're powerless. Hatred goes in circles, and Maelle is no exception. Her anger was fueled by her mother, and without even being able to speak, being able to defend herself, she had no choice than just to accept it. Let herself be washed by these emotions. Aline was growing more and more erratic, not being able to contain herself. She leapt at Alicia, trying to knock her down. In an attempt to defend herself, Alicia, well, she spent a lot of her life as Maelle fighting. She managed to dodge, but what was supposed to be a moment of poor judgment, to say the least, turned into a fatal accident. Aline bumped her head on a floor table. Renoir, disturbed by the sounds, comes running into the room and sees the blood spilling all over the floor. His dear wife is gone. He got closer and closer. Renoir just simply wanted to hold his wife. Alicia frantically grabs the closest paintbrush on the floor and plunges it into Renoir's eye. She stood still, just staring. Before the horrifying scene could settle in her mind, she decided she couldn't allow herself to think. She had to get out of there. The only thing that mattered was the painting. Where could she possibly hide it without having anyone else ripping it to shreds? Before anyone else could bear witness to the death of her parents. Alicia peeked out the window and saw Verso's grave. What other place could be more fitting? Burying herself beside her brother, putting an end to Alicia as we know her. Never to be seen again. As insufferable and direct Clea might have been perceived, no one can really deny that she was in fact the glue of the family, carrying everyone on her back with little to no choice. Thank you everyone for watching. If you enjoy these types of videos, I plan on making more of them in the future. And with that, I just wanted to say that I really loved Expedition 33. I honestly cried at the end. It was so good. And obviously I didn't really play it for myself, but maybe one of these days I will find some time to actually do it. I think it's a very rich story, and the theme around the grief is it's so hard to deal with grief, and I thought they did an amazing job. This is just my take on what if Clea just wasn't there to keep everyone together and to actually, you know, be the glue of the family. I thought it was a really interesting viewpoint, and if you liked it, let me know in the comments section below, and see you in the next one. Bye bye!